Okay, so I did send out again, rather late, an outline for today that's kind of updated. I did a poor job addressing Michael's very excellent question last week, and I commend you all for suffering through that long and rambling answer. But I thought it was such a good
I
question that
forgot what the question was.
I'll go through the question again in just a minute here. But I thought it was such a good question. I thought I should spend more time addressing it so that you had a more organized answer and an answer that would apply in lots of different situations. So the basic question was, after we had looked at all of those passages about the resurrection and the last things, the events of the last day, and I had made the point that the passages did not teach more than one resurrections. No groups of resurrections separated by 1,000 years or anything like that, but that the passages appear to teach that there's one resurrection followed by one judgment. And those passages were all of them from the Gospels or from Paul's letters. At the end, we did look at one passage about the judgment from Revelation, but all of the other passages were Paul's letters or the Gospels. We may have looked at, 1 John also. So the question was, how is it that good Christian people can have some disagreement about the resurrection or resurrections? How is it that some good Christian people looking at the same passages that we looked at come up with the conclusion that there are two resurrections separated by 1,000 years? And I thought that was a really good question, and it is about a really important subject, which is the how to interpret the Bible. And it turns out that people have different interpretations of the Bible, you may have noticed. And so the general question is, how do people arrive at different interpretations of the Bible? And I've got a short slide presentation that I've put together, and then I want to look at a passage in Isaiah to talk about that. So let me put the passages up first. And let's see, put the passages up, and then I'll put up the slides. So let me do that. So isn't that cool looking? Look at that. Same passages, different interpretations, arriving at differing views of the resurrection or resurrections. It's the question. I just mentioned it. How is it that good Christian people read the same passages and conclude that the Bible teaches that there are multiple resurrections? And this is a question about passages in conflict and how we resolve them. So this is the question I'm going to be addressing here, is how do we resolve passages in conflict? And so before I proceed, let me just ask all of you, have you ever had an occasion where you have read several Bible passages and then you read another Bible passage and it doesn't fit with what you thought the other one said?
Mm-hmm.
That's happened to us. It happens to us a lot. What do we do? How do we resolve that? How do you resolve that? And you've got basically three choices, right? You can ignore it. You can set it aside for later, or you can harmonize it somehow. Have you ever thought about how you harmonize the passages? How you make them fit together? What do you do?
I look at the concordance sometimes too to see what their interpretation is.
Mm-hmm. So you look up other passages that have the same words or the same content.
The writers, or what the writer is saying on comments, to see if I agree with what they said.
Okay. So in general, you look for a way to see if you've understood the passage correctly and if there's more information from the Bible that can help you. And ultimately what you end up doing is you end up taking the passage that you thought was difficult, was posing the conflict, and you are able eventually to incorporate it into the group of passages that it formerly was in conflict with. And usually what we do is that we end up interpreting the conflict passage, what we might call a difficult passage, we interpret the difficult passage by the passages that we believe are clear, right? So you take, and we all do that in standard practice, and there's nothing wrong or malicious about it. It's nothing sinister. We take passages that we believe are clear, and we use those to help us interpret other passages. Sometimes we end up thinking the other passage is more clear than the ones that we were formerly believed. And so then we go through a big switch in our understanding. But that's generally how we do that. So we're going to be talking about that. That'll be the crux of, or the turning point of how one group gets to 2 resurrections and how another group gets to 1. So this little chart here goes through just 3 areas between interpretive systems. I have the systems divided here between premillennial systems. You might also call them futurist systems. The premillennial systems are those systems that believe Jesus will come back before the millennium, which is a 1,000-year period, which precedes the final coming or the final judgment. Premillennial systems, there are 2 of them, historic premillennialism and classical dispensationalism. The other systems are either or post-millennial systems. So the hermeneutic, which means their method of interpretation, in a premillennial system is historical grammatical and literal unless impossible. Now I want to say something here, and then I'll explain what I mean by literal unless impossible, but I want to say that my explanation here, I'm talking about in general, this is what the 2 premillennial systems teach. Now, obviously, there's 2 premillennial systems, so there is some difference between them. So I am going to be generalizing, and if a specific question comes up about a specific passage and how might this group understand it or that group, then I can address that. But I want to be clear that I'm not saying that this is their entire hermeneutic and that everybody follows it exactly the same way. But historical grammatical means that when interpreting scripture, the interpreter looks at where is this setting in history? What is the historical thing that's happening? Where is it in the historical unfolding of the biblical revelation? And then grammatical, what are the words? What do the words mean? And how are they being used in this sentence, in this passage? So everybody follows that. You can see on the post-millennial systems, they also follow historical grammatical. Back to literal unless impossible. So what does literal mean? So you'd be surprised to hear that the word literal is very hard to define, but in general, when a premillennialist says the word literal, what they mean is in the normal or plain meaning of the text. So you read a text that says God's going to bless Israel, and you understand it to mean that God's going to bless Israel, not the Babylonians, not the church, nobody else, just Israel. And so literal unless impossible. And sometimes it's impossible to maintain a literal interpretation, and that's because if you interpret it literally, it's in conflict with all your other passages. So then they would go to what's a clear passage. But to talk about according to the postmillennial system, postmillennial and amillennial system, they have according to literary genre instead of a literal unless impossible. So here we have an interesting historical thing. The reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin, they said you need to interpret the Bible literally. But what they meant was that you need to interpret it according to its literary genre. So they don't mean the same thing that a premillennialist means when he says you need to interpret the Bible literally. According to literary genre, here's just a quick chart, and I can send this to you all later. The difference between literal language and figurative language is what's on display here in the chart. In literal language, that language is direct. You go to the store. That's a very, literally you go to literally that store. That's direct. Indirect language is Also figurative. I laughed so hard I thought I would die. That is a figurative expression. It's not literal. I didn't actually think I was going to die. And we have different genres in the Bible and different genres that we encounter in our everyday life. And I've arranged the genres of the Bible on the chart, going from the most direct to the most figurative. And you can see as you go from law to apocalyptic that law is much more direct and concrete. We might say it's more literal. You know, you shall not steal. What does that mean? It means you shall not steal. Now, it's really easy to understand that. Apocalyptic, on the other hand, the seven spirits before his throne. What does that mean? It's obviously the Holy Spirit in the context. We looked at it several weeks ago, so it's not seven spirits, and so we have more figurative language. As you go across the top, law, narrative, teaching, poetry, prophecy, type, and apocalyptic, each one of those genres have different characteristics, and one of the characteristics that is in that changes from genre to genre is the frequency that you encounter figurative language. So in law, you encounter very little, but in narrative, you encounter some, and in teaching, you encounter more. When you get to poetry, it's very, you know, it's we can all see that it's a high degree of figurative language, and prophecy is even higher. Type is higher than that, and apocalyptic is much more figurative than law or narrative or teaching, and is more figurative than poetry, prophecy, and type. And so another way to understand this chart, if you're interpreting according to literary genre, which is what the post and the amillennialist group does, is that there is a presumption of I can interpret this literally if you're dealing with law, narrative, and teaching, that most of the time you're going to run into direct language. But if you're dealing with poetry, prophecy, type, and apocalyptic, there should be a presumption of figurative. In other words, that means that when you come to approach it, you should approach it as figurative, unless there's a good reason in the context that it's literal. So I'm not asking you to agree with the principle. I'm just asking you if my explanation made sense. Does my explanation make sense? Yeah. So we'll go back to the chart. So the two systems there at the very beginning at their hermeneutic are going to be different. They start at different points. This becomes important, and the ultimate answer to Michael's question is how do people come up with different conclusions, is that they start at different points in their interpretation. You can see that if you start with literal unless impossible, and we'll look at an example in just a minute here, that you'll come to a different conclusion than if you start with according to literary genre. You might come to the same conclusion in the law and in narrative and in teaching, because they can all be interpreted with a presumption of literalness. But when you get to prophecy and type and apocalyptic, you're going to have a lot of differences in how you end up. So all of us, when we interpret, as I said earlier, we have in our mind a group of passages or a set of teachings that are biblical that we believe are clear. We understand them as clear. They're clear to us. And a clear passage is one that can be interpreted with our chosen hermeneutic without any difficulty. So it's one that we would look at and we would say that obviously means this. And all of our other passages are interpreted in light of our clear passages. That's what we do. So when we have an unclear passage, we either harmonize it by interpreting it in light of what we think is a clear passage, or we put it aside for later. We say, I don't know how this fits, but I'm going to, keep thinking about it, be on the back burner. Or we just ignore it. We just say, yeah, it doesn't quite fit, but it's not really important. I'm not going to think about it too much. And we all do that. The third thing, ignoring it, is really not a good thing to do. But the other two are allowed. And I want you to notice that on the chart, both groups do the same thing. Right? Both groups, the clear passage is one which can be understood according to their hermeneutic with no difficulty. It's the same. And what they do with the passages are the same. It's just where they start that's different. So at this point, I want to look at Isaiah 65. So let's go there. I'm going to stop sharing briefly and we'll come back. So Isaiah 65 is a passage which will ultimately contribute to answering Michael's initial question about the two resurrections or the one resurrection. And it also provides a really good illustration of what I'm trying to convey here. So Isaiah 65, verse 17 through 25. My purpose right now is not to explain this passage, but to just point out a few things about it. Now let's interpret it. Let's look at it as if we are, whatever your personal hermeneutic is, let's look at this as if we are in the first group of people who interpret things literal unless impossible, because this is a key passage for them. Verse 17, behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight, and its people a joy. I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 will be thought a mere youth. He who fails to reach 100 will be considered cursed. So in that verse, in some passages, some translations, it doesn't say he who fails to reach 100, but the sinner who fails to reach 100. And I think that's what the text says there. 21, they will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. My chosen ones will long enjoy the work of their hands. They will not toil in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune, for they will be a people blessed by the Lord, they and their descendants with them. Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like an ox, but dust will be the serpent's food. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. Okay, so I know you've probably read this passage before, and you may have had teaching on it. Now, if you're coming from the first group, who is ultimately going to conclude that there are 2 or 3 resurrections, this passage says nothing about resurrections, but it is going to come into play in how they get there. If you're coming from this and you're interpreting it with the first hermeneutic, which was literal where possible, then what you have here is a passage that describes situations that are way better than now, but not quite as good as the eternal state. I mean, there are people still dying, so it's not the eternal state, right? And there are infants being born, so it's not the eternal state. I mean, look at verse 20 and 21. You know, there, verse 20, there are people dying. There's even sinners there, so it's not the eternal state. But we have, you know, people living to be over 100, verse 20. And that's regular. If you die at 100 years or less, people think you're cursed. And so you have that. You have, you know, the nature is nonviolent now. The wolf and the lamb will feed together. Verse 25, the lion will eat straw like an ox. Clearly that hasn't happened, right? I've been to the zoo. I've seen lions. They don't eat straw. So now on a literal and less impossible interpretation, lions will eat straw one day. And so, and I'm not making that up. I actually checked that in the books behind me yesterday by reading the people who actually believe that. You know, people who say that. Actually, some of you might believe that, so I'll take the word actually out of that sentence. But that's what it means for literal and less impossible. It basically means if you can imagine a literal fulfillment, then there will be a literal fulfillment. And that's based on the idea that language is that people couldn't communicate unless they used words in a literal way. And so God, who always says what he means what he says, communicates in a literal way. So that's how that's based. So, but you can see that this passage contains descriptions of some time period that, when interpreted literally, do not fit the present age, nor do they fit the age to come. And so what you have then is that this passage somehow must be talking about another age, maybe a temporal age, where these conditions will be met, where people will live a long time, where there'll still be sinners, people are still giving birth to babies, and people are dying, and animals are getting along really well. And Jerusalem is exalted. You know, Jerusalem is the delight and all of that. So you can see that this passage. So now, if you are in the first group of people and you're reading through the Bible and you're just going through canonically, what I mean is you're going through book by book and you get to this passage in Isaiah. This is not the first passage like this, but I'm using it as an example. You would go, well, wait a second, I thought there was like this age and the age to come, but now there's this unknown age where these things are going to happen. What could that be? And so this gets put on the shelf. If you're just thinking about it, it gets put on the, I'm not sure about this passage, I'm going to put it on hold for a while type of passages. And then when you get to Revelation 20, what happens is Revelation 20, we read it, seems to provide, it's talking about a 1,000-year kingdom where it's a temporal kingdom, it's in the future. And so they say, well, there it is. Perhaps that provides the solution to the problem here that I see. And so the millennium, the 1,000 years, is going to look like this. This is a passage about the millennium. So that's how Revelation 20 comes in. Now, how do we get to the resurrection? So Revelation 20 talks about the first resurrection and the second resurrection, or the first resurrection and the second resurrection is implied. It talks about two resurrections, one at the beginning, one at the end of the 1,000 years. And so you go, well, then there's two resurrections, because Revelation 20 then becomes the controlling passage, since it solves this problem of this intermediate kingdom where people are living a long time and they're still sinners and babies are being born and people are dying. Since it solves that problem, then Revelation 20, when compared to the other passages about the resurrection that we read last week, Revelation 20 then becomes the one that is the interpretive lens through which all those other passages are made to conform. If you approach, so anyway, that I have it on a chart which may or may not be helpful to you. Let me put it up there. So this is what we looked at. The next screen is this one. Are those too small to see? If they're too small, I can go through them. So basically,
no,
they're not too small.
Well, of course, I have a big screen.
Okay, we'll go through it. I can do this. So you can see that it's a flow chart where one thing goes to the next thing. So the first thing is Isaiah 65, 17 to 25. What is this about? Interpreted literally. That's basically what happens. So it gets set aside. As we're reading through the Bible, we come across New Testament passages that seem to be clear about teaching only one resurrection. And we looked at some of those passages before. Then we get to Revelation 20, 1 through 6. And when interpreted literally, it appears to teach two resurrections. So now we have a conflict. But Revelation 20 also appears to solve the problem raised by Isaiah 65, the problem of this temporal kingdom. And so Isaiah 65 then is interpreted in light of Revelation 20, 1 through 6. So now there's no more problem, right? Isaiah must be talking about the same thing that Revelation 20 is. But Revelation 20 is now in conflict with New Testament passages which teach only one resurrection. And so how do you handle that? Well, Revelation 21 through 6 is made a clear passage, and other New Testament texts about the resurrection are interpreted in light of Revelation 20. And so you end up with two resurrections. So that's the process. And so, of course, the question then is that the right way to interpret Isaiah 65 and Revelation 20? And how is it that somebody else could come to a different conclusion than this one? And so that goes back to our chart. You interpret it according to the literary genre, and poetry and prophecy are more figurative and shouldn't be interpreted with a presumption of literalness. And so now we're going to go back through in a minute. We'll go back through Isaiah 65 and I'll point out a few things there that you might want to consider when thinking about how to interpret it. So that's the basic outline of the answer to your question, Michael. People come to different interpretations because they have different starting points. And specifically on the resurrection, it involves kind of a reshuffling. You know, you have clear passages about the resurrection, and as you go through canonically, you get to the Gospels before you get to Revelation. And so those passages in the Gospels seem to teach one resurrection. But when you get to Revelation, there's a passage that seems to teach two resurrections, Revelation 20, verse 1 through 6. But that passage also solves a problem that's created by interpreting Isaiah 65 literally. And so if you're going to accept that Revelation 20 is fixing that problem, then you also have to accept the two resurrections. And so then all the other resurrection passages that appear to be clear are brought under the Revelation 20 passage. And I'm not saying this in a way that I'm not implying that anybody's done anything strange or wrong or sinister or wicked, because we all do exactly the same thing. Right? We do exactly the same thing. Maybe not with those passages, but we do the same thing with other passages, because at the end of the day of interpreting Scripture, at the end of the day, we interpret things in accordance with our interpretive method. We all do that. And so the question is your method right? So given the method that you must interpret things literally unless impossible, there's pretty much no other option but coming up with two resurrections. Yeah. So the question then is that the right method, or is there a better method? So hopefully that was a clearer answer before we start looking at Isaiah 65. Hopefully that was a clearer answer than my long rambling thing last week. Have I lost everybody? Or was that clear? It's clear to me, but that doesn't mean anything necessarily. Michael, let me ask you, what do you think of that?
It's much more clear. I guess my only challenge is the Bible is a difficult read, and if we can come out on both sides of something like this, I guess there isn't a right or wrong, right?
Well, I think there is I would say it like this: there are better and worse. Better and worse ways to read the Bible.
But it seems you've almost convinced me that there's two resurrections, and if I remember right, you believe that there's one.
Correct. Yeah. So, right. So if you agree with literal unless impossible, then you will be convinced of two resurrections, and good people in the church, better Christians than me, have come to that conclusion. If you believe that you should interpret according to literary genre, you're going, but I haven't demonstrated how that works, but I'll demonstrate that in a minute. And then you'll all be confused about, oh no, I don't know what to do. Should I go with literary genre and do that? So let me just give a word of caution about choosing an interpretive system. First of all, you all have an interpretive system that you already use. You don't need to choose one. You've already got one.
What's that noise?
I don't know.
Not me.
Ah, okay.
Not me.
It was you. It's not you. It's somebody, but it's stopped now. Valerie, it's good to see you, by the way. So what I was saying was that we all have our own interpretive systems already. And we use them every day. We've been using them for years, and they get modified as time goes on. And we say, well, this isn't exactly helping me in the best way, so it needs to be changed because I see these other passages teach this thing, it conflicts with what I used to think, but now I see that's right. So you change that entails a change in your overall system, and they're little changes. So one of the worst ways to pick an interpretive system, though, if let's just say that we were all starting from scratch and we didn't have one and we wanted to pick one. Nobody does that, but let's say that that's hypothetically we could do that. The worst way, or at least Yeah. So the worst way to pick an interpretive system is to say, I like these conclusions. I like these conclusions, and so I'm going to pick the system that leads to these conclusions. That's not the best way to pick a system. The best way to pick a system is to say, this starting principle makes sense to me. I can defend this one. You know, it sounds right to me, makes sense to me. It's defensible. And wherever it goes, then if I'm using this principle and it is correct, I'm gonna, you know, if I'm committed to it and it takes me to here and it comes to a conclusion I don't like, well, so be it. You know, I have to live with a conclusion I don't like. It's the starting points that are the important thing, not the conclusion. I mean, as far as the conclusion is important for the interpretation, but as far as how to evaluate a system, different conclusions are just symptoms, right? They just tell you the output of the system. But to find out how exactly that you got to the conclusion, you have to go back and examine the entire system. And it's actually at the beginning where things are different. It's again like shooting a rocket to the moon. It's slightly different. So let's look at Isaiah 65 again, and I'll point out a few things about that. So I assume you're all still there. And so if we interpret it according to genre, then what we see is that this is a prophetic passage, and our presumption is that there's going to be some high degree of figurative language in it, because it is a prophetic passage, which is a subset of poetry. Poetry, we all would agree, is figurative, and so prophecy then would be highly figurative also. I'm not saying there's nothing literal here, but just as a use of metaphor and figures of speech and literary flair, you get a lot of that in poetry. You get a lot of that in prophecy. So back to the passage. Behold, I will create a new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight and its people a joy. I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and of crying will be heard in it no more. Okay, so here we have the first statement where there might be a problem, a disagreement between a literal interpretation and an interpretation that is looking at it like closer to poetry. There's not going to be any more weeping or crying. Now, literally, that could be interpreted of the eternal state. And this might be about the eternal state. But it basically, so we hear weeping and crying. We're going to hold on to that for a second. Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years. He who dies at 100 will be thought a mere youth, and he who fails to reach 100 will be considered accursed. So people are dying and there's no weeping. We wonder how that works literally. They will build houses and dwell in them. They will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And right here we come into a language where we've seen this language before in the Bible. If you go back to Deuteronomy 28, just keep your place here in Isaiah 65. Go back to Deuteronomy 28, verse 30. So 28:30. Somebody could read that if you've got it. I'm still looking.
You will be,
That's it.
You will be pledged to be married to a woman, but another will take her and ravish her. You will build a house, but you will not live in it. You will plant a vineyard, but you will not even begin to enjoy its fruit.
So I think you can see how Isaiah 65 is using the same images here. What is Deuteronomy 28 about? And what type of literature is it? So you can cheat. You can look at your headings in your Bible.
Well, it's the curses for disobedience.
Right. Curses for disobedience. So this is God through Moses in chapter 27, Deuteronomy 27. They has the peoples do blessings and curses from Mount Ebal, basically curses, and then blessings for obedience, chapter 28, 1 through 14, and then after that you have about 40 something passage, 40 or so verses about curses for disobedience. And if you want to see how they go to 28 verse 1, this is how they start. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. And these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. Now, this setting is historical narrative. This is on the side of prose and not poetry, so this would be more literal than figurative, right? It's almost all literal. This is figurative in verse 28. God will set you high above all the nations on the earth. High is a figurative, metaphorical use of the word high there. This is not talking about a geographical elevation of, of the Israelite people. It's talking about primacy, success over or favor, enjoying the favor of God. So we do have some figurative language, but not very much. And if you go down to verse 15, you'll see that we have the same type of form. However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. So the passage, Deuteronomy 28, is it's in the prose genre. It's in a foundational book, which is Deuteronomy. Genesis through Deuteronomy are the foundation of everything else that happens in the Old Testament, and of all the prophecies of the Messiah. They all come out of Genesis 3, and all of the things that God has done with Abraham and his people in these books. And the language that we read about, you're going to plant vineyards, but you're not going to get to eat it. And you're going to build houses, but you won't get to live in them. This is covenant language. We would call that covenant language. God is saying, if you keep my covenant, I'll bless you. And if you don't, I will curse you. And then he goes through and gives examples of how he will curse people. And then now we can go to Isaiah 65. Keep your finger in Deuteronomy 28, because we're going to go back in a minute here. Go back to Isaiah 65, verse 21. The curse was, they will build houses and not dwell in them. But the language here says, they will build houses and dwell in them. Now the curse was, they will plant vineyards and not eat their fruit. But this one says, they will plant vineyards and eat their fruit. Now, this is not exactly the same as stating the blessing. This is actually refuting the curse. It's the language is written in a reversal of the curse. We read the curse language. This is the opposite. And a key to that actually is verse 20, where in Isaiah 65, never again will this happen. And then all these things are included in it. So it's a reversal. It's a reversal of what's been going on. So let's keep reading here. No longer will they, 22, no longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. Okay, that's clearly a reference to the curse in Deuteronomy. For as the days of a tree, so will be the days of my people. My chosen ones will long enjoy the work of their hands. They will not toil in vain or bear children doomed to misfortune. Okay, let's stop right there. Go back to Deuteronomy 28. Look at verse 32. Verse 32, your sons and daughters will be given to another nation, and you will wear out your eyes, watching for them day after day, powerless to lift a hand. Isaiah 65, you will not bear children to misfortune. Deuteronomy 28:41 says, you will have sons and daughters, but you will not keep them, because they will go off into captivity. So the language of the curse is being evoked by the passage in Isaiah 65, and the basic point of evoking the curse is to say this is a covenant setting. Isaiah 65 is a covenant setting. I'm talking about the reversal of the covenant curses on the people whom God favors. So far, that's the conclusion that somebody would draw from looking at it as it's using figures of speech, it's drawing upon other passages. One of the things I should mention about the literal and less impossible hermeneutic and its use, how they use Old Testament passages, like I'm going from Isaiah 65 and I'm going back to Deuteronomy 28. On the extreme form of literal and less impossible, you don't do what I'm doing. You would not do what I'm doing. You wouldn't go from Isaiah 65 and go, I think that language is familiar, and go look at Deuteronomy 28. You wouldn't do that unless there was a conflict already with a literal interpretation. That's I have a book on my shelf here by Tim LaHaye. We all know Tim LaHaye, the author of the Left Behind series.
Right.
The book I have is called the Prophecy Study Bible. It's got his notes in it. In the very early pages of it, he has 3 rules for interpreting prophecy. The first rule is literal unless impossible. That's his words, not mine. And the third rule is if there's some kind of, if you can't interpret it literally, then and only then are you allowed to go to other places in Scripture to help you explain it. Now that's an extreme position. That's an extreme position. So he would never go to Isaiah 6. He would never go from Isaiah 65 to Deuteronomy 28 because he's got no reason to, because he thinks he can interpret it literally. I mean, he can certainly imagine people building houses and living in them. So he would not go back and see the covenant curse, covenant blessing connection, or even the covenant context. Now, other people with the literal and less impossible, like the historic premillennialists, they recognize more continuity in the Old Testament revelation where you can, and they understand the role of a prophet is to basically be a covenant enforcer. The role of a prophet was to come and say, a prophet like Isaiah, remember that covenant God established with you? Remember he saved you out of Egypt? You see you see that you've been disobedient. God's going to bring the full covenant curse on you. And so the entire ministry of a prophet is covenantal. And so they're all to be understood based on Deuteronomy and Exodus and all of that. So, but we see as we go through the passage that some of the language being used is reminding us of the covenant, puts it in a different setting and gives us perhaps a different understanding of the passage. We'll keep going. Verse 23. So we already read, they will not toil in vain. Let me just make one comment about that. When you read through the covenant blessings and the covenant curses, you can sum them all up like this. In the covenant blessings, your work in the Lord is rewarded. It is prosperous, it is blessed. You'll be blessed in the city, blessed in the country, blessed when you go out, blessed when you come in, blessed when you lie down, blessed when you stand up. You'll be blessed because you're obedient to the Lord. And whatever you're doing out there in the field with your, growing the produce, it'll be blessed. And you're raising flocks, it'll be blessed. All your work will be blessed. Nothing in vain. But the curse is, doesn't matter what you do. You're going to have kids, they're going to be taken away from you. You're going to build a house, someone else is going to live in it. You're going to plant fields and someone else will take it. It's all in vain. Whatever you do, just in vain, waste of time. And so, again, just that's a summary of the covenant blessings. They will not toil in vain. That's a summary of the covenant blessings. And in fact, it's used, you might, I know it's really hard to keep 3 places in the Bible at the same time, but if you go to, I'll just go to it there. I'll tell you the passage. It's 1 Corinthians 15:58. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Paul says, therefore, my dear brothers, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of God, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. This is covenant language. Paul is saying that the Christians are the recipients of the covenant blessings. And he's saying your labor in the Lord won't be in vain. So that's what's, so again, we have a covenant context. We have a reversal of the curse. We're going to keep going. They will be a people blessed by the Lord. And back in Isaiah 65:23, they and their descendants with them. Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear. So God will pay attention to their prayers. The wolf and the lamb will feed together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The dust will be the serpent's food. And that's a reference back to, so literal unless impossible. Serpents and snakes are going to be eating dust. Genre interpretation goes, well, no, this is a reference to Genesis 3:14, where God says to Satan, you're going to eat dust, all your days. It means you're going to be low and trampled on. And they will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. So from a interpreting it according to literary genre, what you end up with is you don't even have the same set of questions. You don't even encounter questions like what age is this talking about? But the question basically is, how is this language related to God's people and the covenant? And what this says is that there is coming a time from Isaiah, sometime in the future from Isaiah, when God will do something, a new heavens and new earth, and at that time the curse will be reversed. Even though there'll still be sinners and death and people having babies. Well, when was the curse starting to be reversed? When is the period where people live and they get married and they have babies and they die and they build houses and they live in them? When is that?
Now.
Yeah, that would be now. When did the curse start to be reversed?
At the cross.
At the cross. Right. And so if you interpret it from a literary genre point of view, you're going to come up with a different answer. You don't even ask the same questions. Let me show you one thing that's also interesting here. Verse 25 says the lion will eat straw like the ox. So basically we have a tame lion, or a lion that's kind of like a cow. You could draw as pet cow. So the lion will eat straw like an ox. So lions are mentioned in other passages in Isaiah, and it's interesting to look at those passages because they're also what are called by, we'll call them golden age passages. When we just read is a golden age passages. Things are better than they were, not quite excellent, but they're better. Golden age. Let's go to Isaiah 11 and look at that. So Isaiah 11, obviously going to be a golden age passage. Starting in verse 1. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his ears, or decide by what he hears with his ears, sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears. Does anybody know who we're talking about? So this would be, these passages are quoted and applied to Jesus in the New Testament. But with righteousness he will judge the needy, with justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. On a literal interpretation, that certainly means something completely different than on a genre interpretation. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Verse 6, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. This is talking about the same time period as that other passage, Isaiah 65. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. That's also quoted in Isaiah 65. for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That's an amazing prophecy of gospel prosperity. But it is talking about the same time period, and I wanted to point out the lion there. The lion's eating straw. Let's go to Isaiah 35. Isaiah 35, another golden age prophecy. So on the literal interpretation, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. Okay, so the very first thing is a new life given to the earth, renovation of nature. The desert is now, very lush and green and growing. It's the new. It's almost like the new earth. It's the glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come and save you. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. So we have, again, in the natural phenomenon, things are just great. Everything's living and blossoming and growing. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground, bubbling springs, and the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. And a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. The unclean will not journey on it. It will be for those who walk in that way. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor will any ferocious beast get up on it. They will not be found there. But only the redeemed will walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them. This is covenant language. The curses will overtake you. The blessings will overtake you. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. So this is a golden age prophecy. The thing about the lion is really interesting because the other two prophecies said that the lion will eat straw like an ox. Basically, lions will be non-threatening. This way, in this passage, there are no lions. So they're not threatening. Now, in a literal interpretation, you might have a conflict there between lions eating straw and no lions being there. But so I think that's an interesting thing. But we have a golden age passage. Does anybody know when this happens? So let's look at Matthew 11. I think my mom was going to say something, but if you can still say it if you want, if you had something. But let's look at Matthew 11, verses 1 through 5. Keep your finger in Isaiah 35.
Well, I was going to say that it sounds a lot like the ministry of Jesus.
It does sound like that. Yeah. So much so that we see here in Matthew 11, verses 1 through 5. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John heard in prison what Christ was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" Now, I just wanted to make a comment about that. We jump to the conclusion, often I did this myself, that John is having a crisis of faith. But that's not necessarily true. It's not the only answer to the question. I think another plausible answer is that John is not having a crisis of faith, but he knows he's going to die. And so he sent his disciples to the Messiah so that they can meet Jesus and believe in him. And so he sent them with this question: are you the one that we're looking for, or should we wait for another? So, and he's going to ask that. So verse 3 at the end, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. Jesus has just given a list from Isaiah 35, verses 4 through 6. And he said, tell John what you see and hear. And what you see and hear is that Isaiah 35 is being fulfilled. And so, and if you can go back and look at Isaiah 35 verses 4 through 6, and you can see the healings that Jesus refers to. The part about the gospel being preached to the poor, that comes from Isaiah 61. And that's where Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, etc. All of those passages that we just looked at in Isaiah, including Isaiah 61, are taken by dispensationalists who are at the extreme of literal and less impossible. They're taken it by dispensationalists and understood to be about the millennial kingdom in the future. They say none of this has happened. None of this has been fulfilled.
Right.
But Jesus said, this is being fulfilled, right now in his ministry. So let's make sure we understand, we see that again. So Matthew 11:5, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. If you have study Bibles with cross references, you're going to have a reference to Isaiah 35 in your column there. Let's go back to Isaiah 35 and look at that. Isaiah 35:4. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear, your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come and save you. This passage is about when God comes, he will save you.
Yeah.
And how will we know that it's God? Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. This is what Jesus quotes. He says to John's disciples, this is happening because I am God and I've come to save you. And it's happening now. And so the golden age prophecy, Jesus himself says this golden age prophecy, which is linked to the other prophecies that we looked at, is about his ministry. It starts in his ministry. And it's consummated, in the future, in the coming of the Lord and the full glory of the kingdom. But it started now.
Right.
This is the already not yet, the 2-age model that we talked about. And so, if you try to interpret it literally, you come up with one explanation. If you come at it from a point of view of, there's a lot of other factors that actually go into it, but if you just start with this is prophecy and it's referring back to previous more direct language, covenant language, and it's talking about the curse, which is the big problem in the Bible. How does a sinful man get right with God? How is the curse reversed? When is the promise fulfilled? That's the whole point of the Bible. If you look at it like that, then what you come up with is, this is not about some future intermediate age. From Isaiah's point of view, it's about a future age that is inaugurated, that begins when God comes to save his people.
Right.
And Jesus said, I'm here, I'm saving you. and let me show you, let me just point you back to the prophets. And so Jesus does that. And that's what Jesus does when he gets up in Luke 4, right? He stands up and he says, let's look at Luke 4. We got time, I hope, for one more passage. Yes, almost. Thank you for indulging me for the next 2 minutes. I said Luke 4. Wait, hold on. Oh, yeah, Luke 4, verse 16. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. There's Isaiah 61. You can see in your note there. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So he takes Golden Age passages and he says they're fulfilled in my ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, if you start, the point I was trying to illustrate with all of this is that you can make the passages make sense on any hermeneutic. But you'll have different conflicts and different questions depending on what your hermeneutic is. Everybody handles conflicts the same way. We all take clear passages and we use them to interpret unclear passages. What's a clear passage is the one that agrees with your hermeneutic, the one that you can use to explain other passages. So when people come to different conclusions, it isn't because they're not, smart or something like that, or they're not reading the Bible right. There are good ways to read the Bible. There are poor ways to read the Bible. There are better ways to read the Bible. We want to, try to read the Bible in the best way that we know how. My own personal view is that reading it, not starting with the presumption of literalness. I think I do start with the presumption of literalness in Deuteronomy, but I don't when I read a parable. And I don't when I read the Psalms. And if you do that, if you don't start with literalness in the Psalms, then that means you're trying to interpret according to genre, not according to literalism. The last thing I want to say about literalism, the conflict when there's a passage that conflicts with is a difficult passage on the literal system. Basically, it comes down to this: I can't imagine how that could be literally fulfilled, and so it can't be. And so my imagination then becomes the judge of what's literal and what's not. I can imagine a lion eating straw, and so that must be what this passage is talking about. I can imagine Mount Zion be exalted above all the other nations, being a topographical elevation of Zion. I can imagine that, so that must be what's happening. But that's making my imagination the standard of what the Bible teaches. And I don't think we want to do that. Then a better way, like I'll give you an example from Revelation. The 144,000. We can all imagine 12,000 Jewish men from each of the 12 tribes. I mean, conceptually, that's not difficult. Does that mean that that's what the passage teaches? It doesn't mean that. If it's in a vision, then it's probably figurative. So we would then have to approach it a different way. So anyway, Michael, to answer your question, where you start determines where you end up. It even determines the questions you ask along the way. And it's good to know the different wheres that people start from, because that gives you assistance in evaluating where you start from. And if where you start leads you to a conclusion you don't like, that's completely irrelevant. You have to start with, if where you're starting from is something that you can defend and you believe it's right, great. That's what we're looking for. And again, personally, I think starting with genre interpretation makes a whole lot more sense to me than starting with a presumption of literalness, because there are parts of the Bible that are just not literal. I mean, just Psalms. So all right. So I talked a lot, and we were pretty much out of time. But does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions that?
I would say that I guess I'm realizing I'm going to read the Bible differently from this. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let us pray then. Thank you all for your attention today. So I'm going to be happy to put this one up online, because the last one, I thought the question was great and I did such a poor job that I was not happy to put it up online. But I saw nobody watched it, so I might just delete it. All right, I'll pray.